I'd like to start by saying that in the last 1 month or so, since I became an advisor to the governor of Cross River State on SDG, I have been asking myself the question, how do you make change happen? The SDG is a framework for engaging the states in planning, in rethinking inclusion, in dealing with growth and the way growth impacts on communities and societies. But how do you get states to think from that kind of framework? What is the incentive for change to happen? And why do you want states to do that? And I think thinking about the Niger Delta from a governance and accountability perspective raises similar questions as to how do you make the region different. I think there's no shortage of ideas in the region as to what the region has tried to do in terms of changing the context of governance and the context of development in the region. And therefore, the issue of change is great. And it's not just the fact that APC and Buhari are talking about change. I think it's also the fact that at certain points in time, we need to think too about what is different and how we do things differently. The Niger Delta is a region which we're very familiar with in terms of the poverty that exists in the region. It is a region which we know about the huge social as well as economic challenges that it faces, including issues of environment, particularly the infrastructure deficit. These are all things that we're very familiar with. And therefore, when we want to move around and change the context in which this is happening, we're sometimes faced with who are the enablers and what are the things that block our ability to get this to happen. And we find that increasingly, we have looked at the region from a lot of planning perspectives as well. Why are those plans not working? Plans are supposed to be roadmaps. Are they not working? Are they actually working? What are the challenges of those roadmaps? So it is the UNDP that has done extensive work. It has a 2006 report that looks extensively into some of the problems of the Niger Delta. I served as the Secretary of the Technical Committee on the Niger Delta, the Leiden Métis-led committee, and we did produce a report that also didn't go very far. I hate to talk about things not going far. I prefer to think about why is it not going far? Why don't those things happen? The NDDC came up with a master plan as well. So we still, in a sense, you feel, is the region overplanned? Are there too many plans? But it would be sad for us to think, therefore, that we don't need planning. As a matter of fact, the UNDP has suggested that in order to approach the reduction of poverty in the region and some of the deep-seated issues that affect the sustainability of any plan, we need to focus on institutions and we need to focus on people. How do we focus on institutions and people? It says we need to work in partnership with state governments, create upstream, using the language of the oil sector, upstream strategic interventions, which are designed to correct governance and institutional weaknesses, and therefore provide the enabling environment for downstream people-centered activities. In this meeting, it seems to me that the point of departure, when you look at the background papers to this meeting, is that we are in a moment in the country where we talk about shifts in leadership. That's what the document says. There is a shift in leadership. And I think there is a sense in which we have programmatized this meeting to coincide with those shifts in leadership. Coincidentally, too, at the point when there are these shifts, the economy of the country is in need of a lot of rethinking. The wider national context of uncertainty also complicates even that economic situation. What is the wider context that complicates it? Terrorism, militancy. Many development partners today, when you speak to them, they're thinking about IDPs in the Northeast and the problems of the Northeast. So there is also that whole contestation as to where support and resources are going. And more recently, we have even seen the case of young, affected young people talk about the return of becoming the indigenous people of Biafra and the return of the state of Biafra. So again, new contestations are beginning to come into the region, as well as complicating the situation and the times we are. What I'm therefore saying is that the conference assumes a certain context to it. And we need to also interrogate the context which is being assumed. And I'm saying that that context is a context in which several variables are contending for our attention. And therefore, speaking about the Niger Delta without reflecting on the wider context in which the Niger Delta is situated is also problematic in itself. So we need to ask the question, where exactly is the Niger Delta region in all of this? For governance to be meaningful, we therefore need to think about how it impacts on a lot of all these other things. In reaction to the state of the economy, and I alluded to the state of the economy earlier on, PricewaterhouseCoopers, in the policy document on Nigeria says, which is titled, What Next for the Nigerian Economy, actually creates a couple of scenarios. In one of the scenarios, it says we have to navigate the rocky roads ahead, clearly indicating that this economic thing is not child's play. It's serious, very serious. That state governments' finances are particularly perilous. So therefore, you talk of the region, but in actual sense, there is no money coming to the region as the region. Apart from that, that goes to NDDC and a few of these supra institutions. But the monies actually go to the states. And when you are in a situation where the Naira is plunging and making it difficult for state governments to finance their external debts, which makes up about a quarter of the overall debt stock, this means that a lot of the revenue accruing will be diverted to service debts. So many of the states will fall behind on the wages owed to workers, and of course you know the whole thing around unrest and everything. I've just come up with a few slides, and they're very few. If you look at the slide on the ability to meet their monthly recurrent expenditure, you'll find out that already 19 states or thereabout are unable to meet their recurrent expenditure, and some of the states in the region are also affected. But let's also go and look at the IGR. There again, you see the performance of some of the states in the region in terms of how they generate internal revenue. Our states are not doing well. Akwa Ibom, some of them are definitely not doing well at all. Let's look at how the sustainability ranking is. How can they sustain, are these states sustainable, long-term speaking? Again, that tells you where our states are. Then lastly, let us look at some of the debt profiles of the states that we're talking about. The kind of monies they are owing, Cross River being one of the heavy ones. I just thought I should let us know that we are dealing with a very different context. A very different context. And this context is very important, and as the policy document has said, many states are actually going to be finding it very difficult to do what they do routinely. So it's not business as usual at all. The situation is further burdened by the level of infrastructure deficit. I think it was the USAID country director yesterday that said he's amazed to see the kind of deficit in terms of infrastructure in the region. Charles was telling me he's been out of the country for a while, and only recently he had to travel between Port Harcourt and Calabar and was just couldn't believe what the road had become. I had to come from Calabar, and I know what the condition of the roads are. The deficit in terms of infrastructure, not just roads, all kinds of the complicating. So when we talk about an inclusive economic model for growth, what do we mean in an environment and in a context that is like this? I think that's the big question. So I said the situation is burdened there, where states are unable to meet even short-term debts. The liquidity in the system is becoming a big problem, and they are missing a lot of their repayment capacities or unable to deal with that. So consequently, in this forum, when we emphasize the fact that we want to work collaboratively, how do you get states that have all these differential challenges to collaborate? Because the theme of our conference is collaborative efforts for stimulating investment. How do you collaborate? When will Cross River remember to finish paying its debts and its salaries and turn around and collaborate with Akwa Ibom, for example? What is the incentive for this region to sit together and think about a collective way of modeling its development? What is it that can propel that type of thinking? So, for example, with all the issues that we have today, regional planning requires a new catalyst for growth that can deliver broad-based prosperity to vast majority of citizens. So the argument there is that we need to find new incentive for even the region to work together. I showed you the whole situation about the changing economic context of the region, the way governments in the region are being now challenged differently, the local imperative for governments and governors to deliver on certain deliverables, and the fact that the region begins to be a secondary level of responsibility for them. This conference is also talking about time, but at the same time, the debates that are going on at the national level also make the planning for the region difficult. The Nigerian context has been exposed in the past to difficult times like this. Back in the 80s, when we had a similar collapse in the prices of oil, inflation went up, debt fueled economic policies, and Babangida was forced to go to the IMF and adopt the structural adjustment program. The implications for that, whether we saw a lot of abolition of price controls, mass privatization, currency devaluation, and large reductions in public spending. Again, we are faced with a similar situation. And the discussion going on in Abuja on things like subsidy, on things like the valuation of the Naira and all of that, does not suggest to us that this is going to be the Babangida approach to things. What we are beginning to see is more of protectionism. And again, that creates a new tension between what we do in the Niger Delta and what is being done at the national level. How do we create that balance in terms of the kind of project or the kind of governance and the kind of institutional arrangements that we have in the Niger Delta? I'm saying that we need to think about that. We cannot think about the Niger Delta outside the context of what is evolving in the national context. And at the same time, the Niger Delta has its own peculiarities. So the real choice for government, given its change mantra, are huge ones. Where will they find the balance between the region's core business, which is oil and gas related, and the federal government's inclination towards some form of protectionism for local industries and business? Also said, how far can we, as government, go in the region in the light of the dwindling resources that are available from the federal accounts? What are the potentials for increased investment and trade in non-oil sector, enhancement of private sector competitiveness, strengthening of the rule of law, provision of more effective public administration and financial management, and ensuring greater social and economic inclusion for citizens. The only thing we know today is that the president is the Minister for Petroleum. Whether that means we're going to see more structuring in the region in terms of the sectors that impact most on the region is something we need to wait and see as we go forward. But I then argue that independent of all that is happening at the national level, can the region make a leap forward independently, given the large number of states in the region that are of the opposition party? Or are they going to sit down and wait for the body language of Mr. President? You know, there's the culture of body language that's going on in Abuja and impacting on many of the states. And from what I do know, and I don't know how many of us, in terms of looking at the work we're doing here in the Niger Delta, have actually had some initial thinking around how and what the governors and governments of the new governments in place, the thinking of those governments in terms of how they see what they can do and what they cannot do. But it's very likely that being in opposition, they may also want to be a little bit more careful. Because sometimes organizing even as a region raises a certain level of positionality, which may be against or not against or perceived to be against the, well, putting it, it's against the body language, yes. So my thought is that we're talking about setting a governance structure which will work. And I'm thinking we must be perceptive as we go forward to what the environment that is it. So could it be a fact that, so what's the incentive for collaboration? We need to compromise on broad interests and move forward. Then I go on to argue that, notwithstanding all of this, the region continues to get a lot of money from the federal. And therefore, even if everything else fails, we need to work with what we have. And the question is, what we have, what are we really doing with it? And I think that that's where the PIN programming can begin to look into. What are we doing with what we have? The subnational agendas, and which is influenced by the national government, that's an important factor, but they receive about 40% of gross government revenues allocated to states and local government. The use and management of the remaining 60% is also of huge importance. The region, which is littered with several projects, uncompleted infrastructure and social services, and huge monthly recurrent, has to apply more pointedly to knowing what the revenues that accrue to the region are and how they are used. All the states in the region rely heavily on federal allocations and oil derivations. And the abuse of that has to also be something to look at, and increasingly the way this abuse has stifled the competitive use of tax policies. Over the last decade, high economic growth, these states overspent their budget, resulting in no savings of any forms. Given the situation and the impending imperative for economic reforms, it is certain that some involuntary austerity will propel the states in certain direction, and that is why this forum has to provide the agenda for those states. So my assumption and the foundation of my argument is that the circumstances in which Nigeria is today will propel the states in a certain direction. The situation the states are to will propel them in a certain direction. I know for sure that a lot of the governors are running all over the place looking for foreign direct investment. When they look for it for a while and they don't find it, they'll have to come back home and look at what they have at home and begin to work at home. And I'm just creating points of departure. Where do we get in? How do we get in? And how do we build this? So I said it is against this background that we need to link the assumption to create an enabling environment for stimulating investment and inclusive growth. It will be more safer to conclude that the agendas for the region will become a background material for working, as well as the modalities for their implementation. The present options of accessing resources to carry out projects in the region do not necessarily address an agenda for the region. So what I'm saying in effect is that the way the NDDC and all these other bodies are working do not necessarily mean they're addressing an agenda for the region, and therefore we need to work on that. The states, therefore we suggest that we need to write a new development plan. I do not suggest that we need to write a development plan, but rather that each state in the region, working with the blueprints of its own rich state, can provide a background document for the development of a template that will enable us to work in the region. And I recognize the fact that there is a lot of planning, there is a lot of document, a lot of institution, and a lot of things going on. But what needs to happen at this point in time again is how do we bring together all these efforts and begin to turn them into an effort that addresses the problem of the region. I face the same problem in Cross River State, and that's why I'm elevating it to the level of the region. I went into the State Planning Commission. We have a Vision 2020. We have an economic blueprint for the state. We had the NEAT document that we hardly executed. We have the MTEF documents. We have local government leads. We have so many documents in the state. The state is over-documented. And I'm like, okay, so I want us to get into this is a new government. What should the new government be doing? Do we start all over again with new documents? Certainly not. We don't need to do that. And the same argument I'm bringing to the Niger Delta. NDDC had its master plan. BRACE has done a lot of work. Each state has its state planning commission. And sorry to say, donors, you're great at making us write those plans. Every state has got several of these plans. What and how do they interface? In this season of shifts in leadership, what does it mean to engage those plans? Do we return to those plans, or do we create new plans? And my argument is that given the way these new leaders operate, they all want to be seen to be doing something new. And I've experienced it already, because I spoke to somebody, I said, what about this? He said, oh, we need to do our own. So that's the way it works. We need to do our own. And that's the mindset that may be driving the way we go forward. We need to do our own. So we need a model of governance which is our own. And how do you create that our own? There are a couple of ways we can do it. Pulling together what exists and turning what exists to a state in which it is owned. Then I say that pulling the plans together and doing all of that in itself do not mean that we have got the model that works, nor do we have the model that is accountable. And that's when I try to begin to create an example of what exists, because we are looking for low-hanging fruits now. What exists is, I don't know how many of us are very familiar with the conditional grants scheme, which is something that is extremely open, and because it's called conditional, terminologies can be brought in that enables inclusivity and creates a participatory methodology that allows us to be accountable to different constituencies. Which means if we want to bring in a participatory way of project identification and project building, it allows us to do all of that. So I use that as a model which I think to some degree has enabled commitment on the part of the state, because it uses a matching fund arrangement where the states themselves have to commit certain funds to what they want to do in order to get to where they are going. So I said, the conditionalities associated have an effective way of narrowing states to specific and working with mechanisms that are open to measurement, tracking, and accountability. These and other interventions can build synergy towards the imperative of inclusive economic growth and economic diversification in the Niger Delta. Overall, an agenda-setting approach of this kind will be capitalizing on the voluntary partnership of states, whereas in other ways, it will also allow for multiple stakeholders to respond to the needs of that agenda. Now, given the scenario that I have asked and I've presented, I'm asking myself, what should be the agenda for the region, therefore? What should be some of the agendas for the region? I think we need to call for stringent economic planning. There is no doubt about that. Whatever we do, we need to call for stringent economic planning. States cannot be carrying all of these debts, poorly internal generation, poor allocations, badly managed things, and all of that going together without some level of economic and stringent economic planning needed. And I'm saying that this is within the capacity of the region to enable. Reacting to these developments in the economy, McKinsey Global Institute urges the tying of growth to raising standards of living across the country. Such standards required us to raise farm incomes and create, talking about farm incomes and what was presented earlier, and create jobs in the formal urban sector. What this immediately demonstrates is a need for evidence-based decision-making. What would be an important contribution for this forum is to facilitate support to the region and states on data gathering for specific delivery of programs and services. A critical initiative for accountability is where the region can base its actions on best practices that have been well established around the world. States must go away from the temptation by leadership of treating its solution as peculiarly Nigerian, with no commensurate implications for accountability. Furthermore, the recent 2015 Nigerian Economic Summit talked about the tough choices that we have to make and how to achieve competitiveness, inclusive growth, and sustainability. The Nigerian Economic Summit Group made a number of proposals in the face of sharp decline in crude oil prices. Their key proposals touched on jobs, dismantling the pillars of corruption, establishing and building upon pillars of sustainable growth and development, which include macroeconomic stability and growth, fiscal and monetary policy reforms, restructuring of the federal government revenues, small and medium-term enterprises, small and medium-term growth reforms to improve funding mechanisms and further diversify the economy, institutional reforms, accountability, ICT, competitiveness, infrastructure policy, removal of bottlenecks, human development, alignment of homegrown long-term development agenda with the UN Sustainable Goals, which will take effect from January 2005. This long list of activities are important in terms of us identifying the way forward. The region does not seem to have a shortage of ideas for action, but there is need for coherence and agreement by the component parts on how to proceed. Now, one of the things that I was asked to do was to look at what institutional arrangements exist. And I go back into history to see that apart from so in terms of what my presentation represents, in terms of the environment in which we operate, we do now know what the environment looks like for the region. We also know that the region has a lot going in terms of activities, but what are the specifics? In terms of the history, we know how we moved from the Wilkins Commission to the Niger Delta Development Board to the Niger Basin Development Authority to the Special Fund on Oil Producing Areas, UMPADEC, to NDDC, and the many others that are also operating at the state level. However, the story continues to be that these agencies have had limited success. And this has been blamed on a number of things, including the absence of a Marshall Plan or the absence of an integrated plan, poor project implementation, crisis management, discontinuity in government, absence of projects, inadequate funding, weak coordination, poor partnership, corruption, mismanagement, and lack of accountability. These are some of the complaints that go with the institutions that exist. So in effect, we're saying that even that which we have is not delivering on what we expect them to do. It would seem that the states cannot be excused when it comes to the failure of these super-state institutions, or supra-state institutions, because as members of the governing and management board of NDDC, for instance, they should have sufficient leverage to demand accountability on what is due to them. It will seem that such funding has been used in ways that cannot be said to have changed the context of the region. It is, however, my hope that faced with difficulties or the difficult times that we are, The states will rise to the challenge and intervene in this matter, which is clearly begging for reorganization and reform of its institutional accountability mechanisms. It is very doubtful that with so many years of documented misgovernance by the NDDC, it can currently deliver on the transformative agenda for the region. It will make more sense to identify very few specific programs for the Commission, reduce its access to rent-seeking and patronage-driven intervention, and build it into a facilitating body with much fewer responsibilities which do not compete with the governance at the level of states. Drawing the examples of the CGS again, states apply for the resources available to them, and this is done using an agreed template. What a model such as this can do, it will take the initiative to distribute projects away from the NDCs to the state, but compel the states to focus on the agenda for the region. This will make the state to justify the use of the funds in specific forms as required by the budgeting processes of the state. One such requirement will be a public hearing and debt budget defense in houses of assembly. The issue of building the budgetary process and making it participatory is a useful accountability mechanism. Others include setting procurement standards against national pricing standards, which will also reflect on what is obtainable in other African countries and developing countries. While the MDG has used some of these standards with good results, the output for most government-facilitated projects remains low. There are many ways to change this particularly, but inputting into the framework requirements that allocation of funds can be used in ways that reinforce global standards and make partnership for growth possible. The partnership with private sector playing a major role of driving quality and competitiveness while still opening the region to foreign direct investments and growth. Now, the argument here is that we don't have an excuse anymore in the Niger Delta for saying that, oh, the money that is NDDC is not our business, because in a way the governors pretend as though that, or act as though that money is not important. We now have a responsibility to get the governments of the region interested in what is happening. And one of the ways I'm beginning to think that we need to move with that is to reduce the ability for rent-seeking and patronage that continues to create a bottleneck for the NDDC and makes it difficult. And that is also moving its mandate away from being directly responsible for contracts. What is the business of NDDC building toilets or something in my constituency? I mean, it doesn't make sense. You know, why don't we use the state mechanisms? Because when it goes through the budget of a state, at least the state is compelled to go and defend its budget. I know the houses of assembly are extremely weak and can't do very much, but at least those systems are in place. And you can compel those systems using, back to the conditional transfer, a process that forces certain levels of conditionalities. I like the word conditional grants because it puts conditions, and conditions can be anything. Conditions can be anything. It has to be negotiated. I am not saying use the exact model, but I like the word conditional because the conditional preconditions or pre-states or pre-commits you to what you are getting yourself into. So the NDDC example is what I am looking at and saying that if we look at the Orosanya report, although the mandate of the NDDC is something we know, I don't want to go into that. One of the commissioners of NDDC says, for example, about the NDC, the office kills every viable program and policy initiative by the board and stifles their implementation. It ridicules the decision of the board by permitting NDDC contracts award letters to be flouted outside the commission and sold cheaply to contractors. I mean, this tells you what's going on in there. When Orosanya committee was set up, it had reached a point that they were almost fighting themselves inside the NDDC itself. So things were not just working. And it also goes to show the context in which it apparently meant governments and governors were not interested to. Because how could you have a system set up and you had sent a representative to that system on the board and nothing was happening that could impact on your state, and as a state, you just went off and started braced. I'm sorry for those who are involved with braced, but you went off and started braced, you know. That's what you did. But again, brace is just for South-South, not the whole region, as it were. So NDDC then has all of these big management problems, huge problems. So it's an important body, and it works in funny ways, but it hasn't been exploited sufficiently or explored sufficiently to see what it's done. And A.D. Odivier wrote in this day that BRACE became a case of what he calls no smoke, no fire. That's how he described it. In Alaibe's opinion, he thought people like BRACE should have supported them with the running of the master plan, because the master plan was there for all of us to come and join, you know. So the more the merrier. Anybody can come. The master plan is there. Let's all join hands and do it. And this also showed that this region just had many things going on there. So many things were going on. Then came another one called the Amnesty Program, with a lot of money going in that direction. And I say that although Amnesty Program has assisted in some forms to demilitarize the region, it has not addressed the serious security situation where people of means cannot do legitimate business without fear of being targeted by criminal elements. With such an important gap, the question today is whether by merely servicing ex-militants, the program is not unwittingly creating new forms of exclusion and compounding the peace of the region. Today we have militants in Cross River State, Ijaw militants. I'm sorry, I'm not against Ijaw people, but Ijaw people have moved militancy to Cross River, and we have joined them. And I don't know how this program is going to continue to deal with the complications, because it has now become fashionable to be a militant. So other things are coming, and if I cannot be a militant, then other forms of criminality, you know, it is in levels. Militants are the big boys. The criminals are the lower level. So the region is being recriminalized in other ways. And yet, with the massive amount of money going into the amnesty program, it has just sidetracked the whole problem of insecurity in the region. And here it is again, inclusive economic growth, I beg your pardon, competitiveness, I beg your pardon, with the growing criminalization of the region. Look at us in Calabar, the most peaceful state in the country. Where are we today? You know, all of this texturing is important for us to bear in mind. And what I'm therefore saying is that, as far as I'm concerned, we need to revisit what the amnesty program is about. And more importantly, because the monies available to it are huge. If we want to have a competitive region where economic growth, stability, and prosperity comes in, we must address the question of insecurity. Bring back the money that is in the amnesty program. Put it into proper programs that deal with the question of insecurity in the region. As a matter of fact, I think the way the program is currently structured is actually fueling new forms of criminality. So I'm saying that with such an important gap, it's therefore the scope of the regional input into the design of it. I asked, is there a scope for us to input, is there a scope for the region to input into the amnesty program? After all, it was an initiative of Mr. President. It was from the top, and I don't know how the bottom to the top is going to work. Whatever the situation, the resources available to that program, if properly utilized towards economic growth, will definitely widen the impact of development in the region and reduce the uneasiness in the region at this moment. The three approaches recognized, the three approaches I have listed, recognize, now, again, I deal briefly here with the question of hierarchy of plans. You know, this is, the whole confusion with the Delta, because I'm coming back to make some recommendations. The whole confusion in the system. You have hierarchy of plans. Alaibe said the master plan is there, anybody can buy into it, which also means that the states keep their plan, but the master plan is up there. So if you were to compare with the plan today for the Niger Delta, is it going to be one of those hierarchical plans? Is it going to be one? So we need to think about the location of the plan itself, and the way the plan interfaces with the lower levels of planning is critical to the work we are doing as a regional intervention. So I think that is important, and that is something we need to look at from the experiences of BRACE and NDC. What was the reason why the plan and the master plan in the region failed, for example? Could it be because it was a how did I call it? I called it something that was up there, and then was it something that reinforced some vertical or hierarchical arrangements? And I think it's important that we address the whole question of the way the plan for the system is, and pay attention to that whole question about it. So I said these institutions and the plans pose a governance challenge for the development of the region, and yet without a functional framework, the problems will subsist. So we need a framework. I have argued that these things have problems. We need to think about it. These are planning issues. We need to think about what model we want to work with. But we need a framework. We can't run away from the fact that we need a framework. And the imperative for inclusive growth has to be strongly advocated by the region awakened to the governance framework. We need to awaken the region again to that governance framework, which needs and does what it needs to do and appreciate is the realities of the time. However, there is need for this, some line of differentiation so that we know what specifics, what subsidiarity, issues of where things are located and all of that. So then I move on to say, what do we do now? Given all of what we know, what do we do? A radical proposal has come forth. I'm saying that there's a lot of money in NDDC, and I know so because I was a member of the House of Representatives, and I know how many projects we took inside them, so we know what happens there, So there's a lot of money there. Oh, you won't want to know what you took inside them. Okay, welcome. This is Niger Delta. You must put pidgin English in Niger Delta. So I'm saying, in effect, and I want to summarize here, that we need a partnership. And I still go back to the SDGs, because the SDGs on the 17th goal talks of partnership. There are models for partnership. So what's the model that allows the donor community to be comfortable, the private sector to be comfortable, and different actors to be private? We need a model of partnership. And I therefore say that the fact that the body language of the president is towards measures, reduce the bureaucracy and the sizes of government. He has retained the amnesty program by appointing a new special advisor on that. He has retained the Ministry of the Niger Delta. He's yet to do anything for the NDDC. Why can't we push for a measure of some sort? What is the Ministry of the Niger Delta doing? You have a full-time minister that sits in the cabinet every Wednesday. He has access to the Minister of Work. He has access to the Minister of Power. He can bring some sort of attention to his region if he has a better coordinating capacity, or maybe not capacity, or mandate, or role. And therefore, by taking away, and incidentally, one of the greatest problems the NDDC has is its location. Its location in the presidency. That is where all the tampering begins. That is where all the manipulations begin. And then what happens downstream? Because upstream and downstream. Downstream is just a manifestation of what has already started upstream. So we take it out and begin to create a Niger Delta ministry. Because it already exists under what we have now, the president has reduced his ministries but has kept that one. And we begin to pull together the resources that are available, statutorily available to the NDDC, that which is going to the amnesty program. And this is significant. My argument is it is significant resources that can affect the region. Significant resources that can impact on the region, including the outstanding debts to NDDC. Huge amounts. Let me tell you some of the ways it can. What about the model of the Sovereign Wealth Fund? What have we learned and what lessons have we got there? If we put the money into a fund, what are the possibilities? Even if we know the way we operate in Nigeria is share the money. Nobody wants to keep it somewhere. So you want to divide it. We have different formulas for dividing it even here in NDDC. My state gets the smallest. I know that. So we have that formula. But it will be in my interest to know that in 2 years, I have accumulated so much in that fund. And I can use that fund to go to the European Union or go to wherever I want to go and use it as a basis to negotiate for more funds or bring investments into my state, because that fund is available to me at some point. So the re-engineering of this whole thing. And then I know people in NDDC will say, but so what is the job for us? Please forget about contracts, NDDC. We don't want you to be contractors anymore. We want you to do the business of supporting, technical support for the implementation of plans. The capacity, let me give you, for fear of being even thrown out of my job tomorrow, my governor has announced a superhighway. I sat down with the economic advisor, and we said, how are we going to do this? We believe we are going to get investors to come, but there is a lot of work. From just listening to him from an economic perspective, I was like, what the hell? We need lawyers that are able to understand those international levels of business so that we get right value for our investment. We need all kinds of skills in place to be able to bring that kind of resource into the state, build out something that is measurable, also get something that will not further complicate the status of our indebtedness, and we work out a sustainability way of dealing with what we are about to do. Governors need to hear that. They need to know so. So if we had a Niger Delta that had technical expertise, NDDC, that to support that kind of work, I think that would be hugely valuable. Rather than building toilets and building few blocks of classroom, which anybody can build. We move them away from those kinds of responsibilities. And take the East-West Road to the Ministry of Works, where it belongs, and not make Niger Delta Ministry only in charge of Ministry of Niger, because for a while, Niger Delta Ministry thought its only responsibility was to build the East-West Road. So we need to change all of that. That's my argument. And my argument is that when we do so, and we create a fund, we remember the conditional grants transfer model, and we bring them together. I may just be dreaming, but it's good to dream, I guess. Well, in conclusion, I would say that that model has a lot of work to be done. We have a lot of work to do. It's not going to be easy to say that it will deliver just because it's there. We now have to sit down. But the point I have made here is that the Niger Delta is not a stranger to all these kinds of plans, models, attempts at doing. We have tried many things here. Let's begin to look at the ones that work. A lot of homegrown things are working. Let's look at them. Let's expand them, elevate them, and use them. I have recommended the use of the SDG framework because it's global. And whether we like it or not, at some point, all of us will be measured in terms of how we are doing on sustainable development. The world will ask us questions even in the region. So we shouldn't be afraid of it, although I'm an advocate for it, but we shouldn't be afraid of it. The beauty of it is that it compels us to think about the people. It says no one should be left out. So Tammy talked about women, youth. It talks about all kinds of disadvantages, marginalizations. How do we find those marginalizations and where we go to locate them? The complexities of communities and societies and how we bring together those people into their planning arrangements. So we need to think about that model as well. And I say that for the region, for fear of contradicting myself, because I said, who am I to prescribe for the region? But we need to think about certain things because our governors are there. They'll still come and say, Madam, no be you be governor, and I mean win election, you know. So, but notwithstanding, job, acceleration of job creation, I'm just looking at what we can do at the regional level, and I'm happy we've just spoken about agriculture and the potentials in agriculture. And I think the speaker said we should be looking at solid minerals, we should be looking at The environment has a lot going in for it, as well as industries and so on. So there are things there. But I think that the infrastructure deficit should be a major part of whatever we do. Security should be something else. And then the other thing should be, how do we make our services effective? How do we make our services effective? And that's where the whole thing about the models for governance also comes into play. It's difficult to decide how to answer a governance and accountability question because there are many ways of looking at it. But I thought we should start with the known, which is the NDDC, the institutions that exist already in the state, and interrogate that a bit, and see how we go forward. I think we must help the body language of the PDP governors. I'm from a PDP state, so that we can stay focused on what needs to be done. Thank you.